Okay, this is 7th grade lesson 4.2. This will be day one. Students will use a percent change formula to solve for or to find a percent of change. Our standard covered is 7RP3 and 7EE3. The page numbers out of the hardcover book are 164 through 169, and out of the practice journal, pages 93 through 96. Today we're going to be working with finding the amount of change. So there's three things that you have to kind of work through in this process. First of all, you need to look at your original information and determine whether or not you increased or decreased. So we're going to start out with some basic, simple equations, and then eventually we'll get into some story problems. So here, the first question I'm going to ask myself when I look at this and I've got 10 inches to 25 inches, maybe we're talking about snow. I had 10 inches of snow. Overnight it snowed, now it's 25 inches, and I want to find out, did it go up or down? So obviously that would be an increase. So we have to identify whether it's an increase or a decrease, and we're going to do that just by comparing these numbers. This is always what you originally start with, is that first number. Okay, in a story problem that may be changed, so you have to pay attention to the wording. Okay, so we just found out it was an increase, it went from 10 to 25. Then we're going to use this formula. We're going to find the change in our numbers. Now, your hardcover book uses something that's slightly different. I believe it says in there, let me peek really quick. The formulas they use is to take the original amount and subtract the new amount, okay? So I just simplified that by just saying, find the change in your numbers so that we didn't have to think between the situations. So here, if I subtract between the numbers, we're just going to always take the biggest minus the smallest. So 25 minus 10 would leave me with 15. So that's my change. It changed 15 inches, or we got 15 more inches. Then you're always going to divide by your original amount. So I originally had, the day before, I had 10 inches. That's originally what I had. Okay, so there's writing my equation. Then I'm going to go ahead and change this fraction that I now have into its decimal and then into its percent. So when we work off of a fraction, remember it's top divided by bottom, just like when we read a page in a book. So we're going to punch in 15 divided by 10, and when I do that, I get 1.5. Okay, but they want the percent change. So I now have to remember to change that to a percent. So going back to what we worked with in lesson 1, remember percent has 2 circles on it, and a percent sign is always on the right side of the number. So we're going to go 2 places to the right, which would give us 150%. So we just found out that we have 150% increase when it went from 10 inches to 25 inches. As you guys are working through these, my expectation is I will see the fraction. Okay, I want to see your decimal. I want to see your percent. And I want to see if it increased or decreased. Those are the things that I will be checking. Now, as you start to get better at these, no, I'm not going to require you to do every single step, but because this is new, I will require all 4 of those in your answer so that I can check to see, is it that you don't know how to set up the fraction? Is it that you don't understand how to move the decimal to change it to a percent? Are you identifying if it's an increase or decrease? Okay, as you get better and we get more comfortable with these, then you'll be able to reduce the number of things that you do. But for now, I want to see each of those steps. Okay, so here's our next one. 72 paper clips to 63 paper clips. Now, I tend to ask if it's an increase or decrease to begin with, and the reason I do that is because otherwise I tend to forget. So I went from 72 paper clips in my drawer to now only having 63. So that decreased or dropped. So I know that it's going to be a percent decrease. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and use my formula. So I want to find the change in these numbers. I'm going to subtract between them. So 72 minus 63 gives me 9. Over what I originally had, which was 72 paper clips. Remember, our original number is always going to be that front number when they're set up like this. In a story problem, you're going to have to pay attention to wording. So 72 was my original number. Okay, so I've set up the formula. Now I'm going to change it to a decimal, and then it's percent. So to a decimal, top divided by bottom. So 9 divided by 72 gives me 0.125. Okay, now I need to change it to a percent. So our percent, remember 2 circles on our percent sign and the percent's on the right. So we move to the right, so 2 places. would be 12.5%. Or if you wanted to round, or a question may ask you to round to the nearest percent, that would be 13%. And we identified it was a decrease. So here's our final answer. It was a 12.5 or approximately a 13% decrease. Okay, so go ahead and try this one. 24 songs to 78 songs. Okay, so remember we find our change, so we're going to subtract between them. So 78 minus 24 is going to leave me with 54. That's my change over my original, not my largest number, but my original number, which was 24. Okay, so this is your MP3 player. You had 4 songs, or your iPod. Now you have 78 songs. I want to know how much it increased or decreased. So when we went from 24 to 78, what did I forget to do? What I told you guys I always forget to do, decide if it's an increase or decrease. So we went from 24 to 78, that's an increase. Okay, so now we'll change it to its decimal form. So 54 top divided by 24 the bottom gives us 2.25. Now we'll change that to a percent. So 2 places this way to the right is 225% increase. Okay, so I'm going to give you one to try on your own. And don't forget to identify if it's an increase or decrease, because like I said and just proved, I tend to forget that one. Okay, I want you to try these 2. So you're going to go ahead and pause your video and then check back on your answers. Remember, I want to see your fraction, I want to see your decimal, I want to see your percent, and I want to see your whether it's an increase or decrease. So go ahead and pause your video now and work your way through these steps. Okay, so you should have ended up with, on the first one, a 67% decrease. Key thing on that one is when you get a repeating number, remember to at least write out the first 2 or 3 digits. 3 is better because then you can round it to the most precise answer. So you'll notice here, if I went to the nearest percent, it became a 67%. A common mistake is kids will write 0.6 repeating, and then when they change it to the percentage, they think they can put a 0 in that back spot and it would become 60%. Huge difference between 60% and 67%. Okay, and then on the second one, you should have ended up with a 14% increase. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and now work off of some fractions. So these are kind of complex. We'll kind of work through them together. Okay, I know working with the fractions is frustrating because of the fraction part. Now, you can go through and change each of these to decimals. So on this first one, I will show you how we can solve it both ways. That's not always going to work because sometimes you get a repeating number. And so you could maybe get an approximation working off of those decimals, but it wouldn't give you an exact answer. So I'm going to start out with just going ahead and working it as fractions. So first of all, when I go from 3/7 to 3/8 to 7/8, that would be an increase. So I know in the end it's a percentage increase. Now I want to see how much it changed. So the key thing here is because I already have a common denominator, I don't have to go through and do the crisscross, straight across, and subtract. I already have the same numbers on the bottom, so I can go ahead and just find my change between these two numbers. So it went from 3 to 7, that's a change of 4 over 8. And we can reduce that if we want to, or we can leave it as 4/8. I'll go ahead and just leave it. So now when we do this, before we would write our change over our original. So our original was 3/8. Here's what we have to remember. Now that we're working with fractions, we have to remember that rule of dividing by fractions. We're used to seeing division of fractions written from left to right. So I'm going to go ahead and write it that way so that you can now see. All I did was I shifted it out of that fraction form and just wrote the division sign here and then put my 3/8 next to it. Okay, so now our rule for fractions is we keep, so 4/8, unless you reduced it to 1/2, that's okay. We change to multiplying and we flip 8/3. Now, I strategically didn't flip it because now it makes it very easy for me to see that I could cross cancel these out. 8 would go into themselves each once. So now I end up with 4/3. Okay, so 4/3, that's our fraction. But remember, we always work and change it to our percentage. So now we're going to go ahead. This was our fraction. We're going to go ahead and change that to its decimal. So 4 divided by 3 gives me 1.3. Repeating, so 3/3. Percentage-wise, we would go 2 places, so it's 133% increase in the end. Okay, had I worked it off of decimals, this would work using decimals. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you that I should get around about the same answer as long as these are not repeating decimals. So if I changed each of these to their decimal form, just so I didn't have to remember all of those rules for fractions, 3 divided by 8 would have given me 0.375. 2, now if I do 7 divided by 8, it gives me 0.875. Now I can go through and do the same process that I did on the previous ones where they weren't fractions. Okay, so first of all, it went from 0.375 to 0.875, so yes, that's an increase. And maybe it's easier for you to compare decimals over fractions. Okay, so now when I look at this, I find my change, so I'm going to subtract between these two. Okay, so 0.875 minus 0.375 gives me 0.5 change. So my change was 0.5 over my original was 0.375. Okay, and I know fractions, you don't normally have decimals. So that's the thing you have to understand is when you're working with in this format, it's okay because we're going to that next step to have a decimal in there. So now I'm going to leave 0.5 on my calculator and divide that by 0.375. And when I do that, I get back to the same number, 1.33 repeating, which becomes 133%. Okay, so if you're more comfortable changing it to its decimal form, you can do that. Just realize that sometimes that will not work because maybe you get a repeating decimal for your fraction. Okay, so let's try one more. And once again, we'll just do this one together. Okay, so we've got 1/4. I'm going to go ahead and work it as fractions. If you want to work it as decimals, you can change each of those to decimals and then we can compare our answers in the end. So 1/4 to 1/2. Well, if I only had a fourth of a pizza and then I had a half of a pizza, that would be an increase. So I know in the end it's an increase. Okay, in order to find the change between these, I have to have a common denominator. Or I can do that, crisscross. Here, it's not going to matter. I'm not going to have a negative answer, even though here I set it up that way. So I'm going to find the difference between, I should have written this out the other way, 1/2 minus 1/4, just so that I follow the rules. Okay, so I would have 4 minus 2 over 8. So when I do 4 minus 2, that gives me 2/8, which is 1/4. Okay, so that's my change over my original, 1/4. Okay, a fourth divided by a fourth looks like this. Hopefully you could do that in your head, but maybe not. Maybe you need to see it. So then it becomes 1/4 times 4 over 1, which is 1. Okay, remember, you now have to change that to a percent. So 2 places, decimal's not shown, it's here. 2 places, it becomes 100% increase. Okay, if you worked decimals, this would have been a 0.25 and this would have been a 0.5. So then you would have gotten a 0.25 change over a 0.25 of the original, which would still get you down to that 100%. Okay, so working with fractions, Once again, you choose. You want to change it to its decimal form, you can do that. So the key thing out of this part of the lesson is identifying whether or not we have an increase or a decrease. Okay, so looking at your original information, then you're going to use the formula, a change in your numbers. So you're going to subtract between your numbers over the original amount, then change that fraction into its decimal and percent form. Good luck with this.